I'm talking about this because it's something that's near and dear to my heart and my own experience, and something that I've been experimenting with in some way pretty much my whole life. If you think about it, we're talking about the mind all the time. Never mind your own business. Can't get this out of my mind, can't get her out of my mind over matter. It seems to be, in one sense, something very intimate, something that we kind of know about in this vague way. And yet there's no discrete knowledge about it that we talk about. And it really took me like 6 to 8 months to recover. And then it slowly got better, but it was incredibly difficult time for me. The other side is this kind of reflective side of my nature that was always there since I was a kid. In this time in residency, when I had my life turned upside down, essentially starting my second month, these two sides of me were clashing. These two sides of me came crashing together, and I had to make a decision. Every person at some point in their life starts to ask the bigger questions, or starts to wonder about the bigger questions. And at least on the surface, it can seem that that's at odds with emergency medicine. One of the most frequent comments I get is, "You're an ER doc?" When we talk about the mind, what is it that we're actually talking about? So you have the cloud-like thing, and you have all the thoughts and all the images and everything else that might be going on. Whatever that is happening in that moment, that then kind of jumps out to the foreground. Right? There is an anatomical aspect to the mind. And what I'm suggesting is that we've been trained to see the human being incompletely. And yes, it affects patient care, but even more, given where EM is now and given all that is happening now in EM, it's really that we are seeing ourselves incompletely. We're kind of, if we're to look at the mind as an aspect of our anatomy, how could we understand this? First of all, that EKG that comes in front of us, that would be our foreground perception. The other layer, of course, if this is the foreground perception, is what we talked about before. It is all the stuff in the back, right? And what is all the stuff in the back? It's the thoughts and the feelings that have accumulated over your shift. Everything from up to a lifetime to up to a minute ago is occupying this background layer of the mind. We're taught to train our attention on the foreground layer, but there's also this background layer of the mind that is there for all of us and that is influencing our decisions all the time. So the only question is whether we become aware of it, or whether, now that we've practiced a little bit and noted the first layer of mental anatomy, let's now shift attention from the foreground of perception to the background of feeling and thought. Let's take a few moments and see if we can notice that. But there's another kind of difference when we're not just looking from that perspective of this third layer, but the attention is actually turned on itself. And the experience of this, what it feels like, is simply like an openness, like a feeling of vastness, a feeling of utter relaxation. Well, let's just try this for a moment. This may seem really abstract or strange or difficult, and that's okay. What matters here is not so much whether we're successful or not in recognizing all of these layers or accessing all of these layers, but simply hearing that these are possible. In fact, what happens many times when I give similar talks is that people will understand a certain percentage of it, but by doing some of these exercises, I'll get an email a couple of days later, a few weeks later, sometimes several months later, and being like, "Oh, okay, I get what that meta mind was about," right? Because it's not something we really have a language for. And if we do have a language for it, it gets labeled as, well, that's spiritual stuff, or that's just wellness, right? But it's really just a layer of the mind. So let's just play with it for a moment. Hansel and Gretel, I think it was Hansel and Gretel, who dropped the breadcrumbs to get back to home. Similarly, the breadcrumbs leading to the meta mind are kind of the releasing of attention, right? The way we look at the foreground is by clasping onto certain perceptions. And by kind of releasing attention from all these things, you're kind of following the breadcrumbs back to that undifferentiated attention, as opposed to the differentiated aspects of attention. And then the fourth and last aspect of mental anatomy I'll share with you is this boundary. When you can sense this boundary, that becomes a key indicator of your mental well-being. You can start to sense that tension. And what I'm saying is that tension that you're starting to sense is not just something vague. There's actually a boundary in the mind that's kind of getting full and getting stretched. And the more sensitive we become to that, meaning the earlier and earlier we pick that up, we can start to take steps to work with that boundary at that point. So in society, often becoming sensitive to these things is a bad thing because it shows that we can't handle the foreground experience, which I think is rubbish, right? All of us have all layers of the mind. It's only a matter of if we recognize how they're driving us or not. So let's just practice this for a second. Let's now again bring attention to the foreground experience. So maybe it's the visuals or the audio, whatever is your foreground experience. And now release that and shift into the background. What does the mind feel like? Right? Get a sense for that. And now, if possible, release that as well. If you're feeling strain, that's the boundary that you're feeling, right? Strain is that boundary getting pushed, right? It's only when I think that foreground experience is everything, which is really a cultural interpretation, then everything else becomes a dissociation. And so just be aware of that stigma as well. This is not about dissociating from what's happening. This is not about avoiding what's happening. This is not about not dealing with things. This isn't about, meditating to escape the world. These are all misconceptions. This is simply a way of exploring more and more of our mental anatomy and using the wonderful tools that become available. So think about turbulent flow and laminar flow. This is the experience of turbulent flow of attention. As the mind tries to navigate this, right? What happens when something comes into the foreground experience, all of the attention has to bump into all the stuff, go through all the stuff, become modified by all the stuff before it comes into that foreground experience. And that's where you get this kind of shaky attention. Right? If you just look at these two pictures, there'll be one picture, I won't tell you which one. There's one picture where you'll be like, that's the mind I want, right? It requires no education. It requires no understanding. It's an innate sense that we have that, you know what, this just feels better. And so one thing that we can take out of this is to recognize that the more spacious the mind is, the happier and the more easeful a life is. What I'm surely not saying is that this means that when something is hard, I meditate and my problem goes away. No, I'm not saying, okay, let's be mindful and now everything's happy. No, the problems that we're facing, we still need to deal with. If, like in the beginning of the pandemic, there's no PPE and we don't know much about the virus, then that needs to be addressed. We need PPE. We need to talk to business, talk to the manufacturing sector, political pressure, whatever needs to be done. Those actions are necessary. This is not a substitute for acting. This is about bringing much more resource to the foreground experience, right? So it's not one or the other. It's not either wellness or EM. It's not spirituality or science. These are all false dichotomies. I'm not saying to anyone who may be suffering or having a hard time, I'm not saying go meditate. I'm not saying go be mindful. I think that's the wrong message. I'm saying to all of us, to all of EM as a specialty, that we all need to educate ourselves on this aspect of what we are, not only for ourselves, but so we can be there for our colleagues. So when a colleague reaches out, we know how to respond, or even before a colleague reaches out, because we have become sensitive enough to our own boundary and our own layers that we can recognize, you know what, this person may need a hand and we can reach out. So going beyond the traditional notion of wellness, advocacy is needed, political action is needed, but we need to start including education about the mind. So it's no longer something strange, it's no longer something weird, but it is the actual instrument that we are carrying around 24/7. And we either become aware of it or it drives the bus without us knowing. We are always taking care of someone else's emergency. Let's start taking care of our own.